Well, good morning, church. It's good to be with you, and thank you, ladies, for that song. It goes right along with the sermon today. God will provide. He's always there. Reach out to Jesus. And today, we would like to describe a little bit about the character that we represent much of the year at the Joseph Bates house. But before we do that, we want to reflect on the fact that the Bible has lots of stories. And people like stories, don't they? I mean, when you get the personal experiences, it helps us relate more to the messages of Scripture. And so the Bible's full of stories of faith. Yeah. Before we do that, we're going to do the children's quiz. And so, got some questions for you kids. Was the man who preached in Maryland a sea captain, a merchant, a deacon in the church, or all of the above? Second question, Joseph Bates, drove which kind of a boat? A speedboat, a tanker ship, or a sailboat? And question number 3 was Joseph Bates was a farmer, a preacher, or a race car driver? And the special word today, and by the way, Bev's not here, so has anybody got the lollipops today? Okay, Sandy's got them over here. So count the number of times we use the word provide. That's the key word for today, all right? So when God brings faithful people into our world, He reminds us that they're faithful because they're faithful to Him.
When we were thinking about this, let's see if I can get on because I've had laryngitis now for a couple of weeks. It's been so much fun. These words from Henry Wordsworth Longfellow called the Psalm of Life, in this poem, the Psalm of Life. Lives of great men all remind us we can make our lives sublime, and I would change that to God can make our lives sublime. And departing, leave behind us footprints in the sand of time. Footprints that perhaps another, sailing o'er life's solemn main, a forlorn and shipwrecked brother, seeing shall take heart again. And today, as we look about God's leading, at the Bates house, there's one saying, there's actually two sayings of Bates. One is they said he used to sit in testimony meetings and he would clap his hands and he would say, "How I do love this Sabbath." But the other one was that the Lord will provide. And we're going to tell some stories today, how God provided. And maybe you may be struggling at a time in your life to remember through the fog or through the clouds, and you haven't seen the rainbow yet, but there is a God who's still there, who still provides, and who still loves us.
So one of the important things for us to do is to remember how God has led us in the past, because that reminds us that He's still faithful for the future. And Moses understood that, and as the people of Israel were just on the borders of the Promised Land, why they listened to quite a lengthy sermon. The whole book of Deuteronomy basically is a sermon by Moses telling them what to expect and how to safeguard their spiritual experience. And one of the things he says here is that Abraham answered, God Himself will... No, that was Abraham. I'm sorry.
You went past, I think.
Okay, I went one too far. Here's the Deuteronomy one with Moses reminding the people, fix these words in your minds and your hearts, And tie them as symbols on your hands and bind them on your foreheads. Teach them to your children, talking about them when you sit at home and when you walk along the road, when you lie down and when you get up. He even advised them to build monuments. And everywhere they traveled, they were to build an altar. And when the travelers came by those monument places and the kids asked, "What's that about, Dad?" then Dad would be able to tell a story of the history of God's leading of his people. I got it.
No, you don't.
We haven't done work together too much like this before, so
It's been
bear
a-
with us.
We have, but it's been a while. We've been retired, remember. The scripture reading for this morning is the story that comes to my mind first about the Lord will provide. Because Isaac asks his father, "Where's the lamb?" And Abraham replies, "The Lord himself will provide." And Abraham, God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son. And then in verse 14, and I had forgotten this point, Abraham called the place, "The Lord will provide." You know, maybe we need to find some places where that we name "The Lord will provide."
Jacob also was blessed, or Jacob was blessed by God. And this text says, "I will provide for you there because 5 years of," now this is Joseph, "because of 5 years of famine are still to come, otherwise you and your household and all who belong to you will become destitute." Here's a promise of God that says, "I will provide for all of your needs as whatever crisis comes." Here's another one from Genesis chapter 50. "So do not fear, I will provide for you and your little ones." Thus he comforted them and spoke kindly to them. So God uses these promises in the Old Testament to remind us of his faithfulness. My faithfulness isn't so good, but God's always is.
And this next one I found, I was doing to find the text, and I hadn't realized this one, but this is 1 Corinthians 10:13. "No temptation has overtaken you that is not common to men. God is faithful, and he will not let you be tempted beyond your ability. But with the temptation, he will also provide the way of escape." God will provide.
And another text here, it says, "Be careful not to forget the Lord who brought you out of the house of slavery." So the safety for our future is to remember God's providence in the past. When we get to those hard spots, those tight spots, just remember, God's always been faithful and he has an answer. Today we want to introduce you to a couple of people. The picture on the right is a picture of Joseph Bates in his older years. We're actually not going to be telling the part of the story that goes with his older years, but this is about the only picture we have. We do have one picture of a young man, but we couldn't find one to put on the screen. And his wife, Prudence, is next to him there, and she is a remarkable lady. I wish we could be able to tell you more about the tours that we give, but we'll have to keep it pretty simple.
So why would we spend 7 months of our lives every year in Massachusetts? And why does the church own a property there that's the boyhood home of Joseph Bates? Well, I share something with you, and it's on screen, but this is the visitor's guide for the town of Fairhaven. And I've marked it so I don't have to look. But here's actually one full page and part of another, and it says Captain Joseph Bates, Jr. His father was senior, founder of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. And then a few pages over, it talks about walking Poverty Point. And the first place on the tour is the Joseph Bates home. So here's a man who's recognized by our church, but by also his community, as a man who was a remarkable leader. And as we tell some stories about him, he was a man who allowed God to use in amazing ways. He was flawed like all of us, but he committed his life to God, and forward he moved.
So for those of you who might not know who Joseph Bates is, he's famous to Adventists because he's the father of the Sabbath message. He's actually the one who helped put together the great controversy theme, connecting Revelation and the sanctuary message and the Sabbath message all together, even before Ellen White wrote the book by that name. And he's one of the three founders of the Seventh-day Adventist Church.
Okay, this is the Bates Homestead, built in 1742, or at least part of it. Part of it as late as 1900. It's the oldest house in town, so that brings some interest for the community. Built in 1742, when the house was about 50 years old in 1793, Deacon Joseph Bates moved his family to this home. His fifth child, who was about a year old, was Joseph Jr., or Captain Bates. The family lived in basically 2 rooms. And ladies, as I clean and as I go around the house, I think what it would have been like to take a family of 9, because they eventually had 7 children. The one was born about the year they moved in 2 rooms in Massachusetts winters. Now, less winter in Massachusetts has been no more harsh than your winter here. In fact, there's no snow at Bates right now. But think about these people. Deacon Bates was the head deacon of the Congregational Church in town. He was a merchant. He had moved to this town because it was a seaport, and so it gave him opportunity to buy and sell from the ships coming and the people in the area so that he could support his family. He was a man of strong character. We don't have time to talk about him a lot this morning, but as we care for the graveyard, he and his wife and their daughter and 2 of Joseph's daughters are buried just about a half mile up the road from the house. And so we go to those spots and think about what people did that made a difference in my life today. And as you're pulling weeds and spraying mold and all kinds of things that you get to do, and in addition to giving tours, you get to think about these people.
Joseph Bates lived just a block from the sea harbor. And Joseph Bates Jr. is the one that we're talking about today. He grew up watching those tall sailing ships sail up and down the river. They actually built them right a few blocks from his home. And during that era of history, that was the best way to get around. If you wanted to travel from a town on the coast to another town on the coast, you got on board a sailing ship. If your cargo needed to be carried, it needed to be on a sailing ship. No motorboats back then, no steamships or whatever. And as he watched those sailing ships come up and down the harbor, that just looked like the most romantic lifestyle that there could be, I can imagine. I can imagine young Joseph going down to the seafront and talking with the sailors and hearing their stories of adventure and all of the places that they had been and their horror stories. And that was the life Joseph wanted. He begged his father, please, I want to go to sea. Finally, after years of begging, at the age of 14, his father did allow him to take a short voyage with his uncle to Boston, hoping that would cure him of the desire to go to sea. It had the opposite effect, and he spent the next 21 years of his life as a sailor. He wrote about it in a book. his autobiography. Dora has a copy here. It's really a fascinating book, a story of adventure. His life was almost lost on a number of occasions. I don't have time to tell all those adventurous stories, and so the abbreviation will kind of diminish the effect a little bit of the adventure. But on his very first voyage, he fell from the rigging of that ship into the sea that was infested with shark. And as he ended up coming up out of the water and seeing the ship passing away from him, one of his fellow sailors tossed him a rope and they hauled him back on board. And then somebody said, "Where's the shark?" The shark had been following their boat for hours. And at the mention of the shark, young Joseph, just 15 years old, started to tremble. And then he started to think. He hadn't been particularly a religious chap up to that time. And now he couldn't explain why the shark that had been following the ship right where he had been was now swimming on the opposite side of the ship where he'd fallen in. And he wondered, is there a God who has a role for me in my life?
And if you'd like to read the book, it's online, free. You just Google the autobiography of Elder Joseph Bates, and you can read it. If you like a paperback, you can talk to us. We can tell you where you can get it. But a fascinating book. He was not a Christian, even though his father, he said, was always a praying man, and his mother was converted during a revival when he was about 12. But if you think about it, he went away to sea about 14, and he had responded to that revival at 12, but he was so busy going to sea, and then he got impressed by the British and ended up imprisoned by the British. He marries a woman who's a Christian. And one time she decided that when he was packing his chest to go to sea, that he was putting too many novels in. So she puts a very small, and I should have one, but it's in Massachusetts, New Testament, and a poem about what happens when you die, and puts that in the top of his sea chest. And when he gets to sea, he starts reading the Bible. And all of a sudden, his novels are not interesting to him at all. All he wants to do is read his Bible. But he's the captain of his ship by now. It's close to the end of his sailing career. He's probably about 33 or 34 years old. And he's ashamed to let his sailors see him praying. Now remember this as we talk later, because God changes him dramatically. He's the captain, he has his own quarters, and he fixes a place under his table where he can read and pray and no one can see him. And he does that routinely. And when he comes back to Fairhaven, he's baptized into his wife's church. And when we hear the bells ring in Fairhaven, because the Congregational Church has beautiful, well, actually the Unitarian Church too, have beautiful bells. And he talks about in one of his logs, his logbook, which is a diary of the captain at sea, he talks about missing the bells calling people to worship in Fairhaven.
Joseph Bates worked his way up from beginning as a cabin boy, that was just kind of the gopher on the ship, a young boy, to being captain and part owner of the ships that he sailed as he ended his career. He made a good living, better than most, probably. And one of the things that his wife had insisted on knowing when he asked her to marry him was, how long, or are you going to stay a sailor all of your life? In fact, she probably put it more like this: I don't intend to marry someone who's going to be a sailor all his life. And Joseph probably scratched his head and said, well, I don't plan to be a sailor all of my life. And she wanted to know, well, how long then? And she kept persisting until he said, well, when I get $10,000, I think that will be enough to retire on. And it took him another 10 years to get that amount of money, but eventually at the age of 36 years old, he retired as a sea captain.
And at that time, $500 a year was the wage for a sea captain. So he retired with between $10,000 and $12,000. The amount varies in different sources. So he had between 20 and 24 years worth of income. He's 36, he's healthy, he's doing well. What's he going to do with himself with this income that he has? Well, that's the story, but I'll tell you a few things. When he was baptized, as they were getting dressed after the baptism, he asked the Christian Connection pastor to help him start a temperance society. The pastor declined. Bates was not at this point going to be stopped, so he went around with a piece of paper and got people to sign up, including the congregational pastor, who would have been the pastor for his parents' church. Was one of the first temperance societies in America. They then formed a Bristol County Temperance Society, which Joseph Bates helped found. Then there was a Massachusetts Temperance Society. I was reading the history, and it's hard to correlate, but in the history there were several saloons that went out of business about this time in Fairhaven. Bates, in his autobiography, talks about the Cold Water Army. Has anybody heard of that? It's where they enlisted kids. You had to be at least 4 years old, but from there on up, you could be part of it, and you agreed to drink water rather than wine or beer or anything else. And he says when he's writing his autobiography, he's found a book that had almost 300 names of children who composed the Cold Water Army. One of the other stories that I usually tell while I'm doing the tour, because I think it's really cute, is when I was a child, we signed a temperance pledge. I bet some of the rest of you did too. Well, that's how they started the society. And they put down ardent spirits. Well, one of their members was seen weaving through the town of Fairhaven, obviously drunk. So they call him to task, and he said, I did not have any whiskey, vodka, or hard spirits. I only had cider. And his wife says he's as mean when he drinks cider as when he drinks the others. And he wasn't repentant, so they kicked him out of the society and rewrote the pledge to any intoxicating beverages. And I must hurry on here. He got involved with others to provide wholesome places for sailors to spend when they were in port. New Bedford was the 5th busiest port in America, and lots of ships coming and going, and a lot of sailors coming to town and spending their money fairly rapidly on things that were not a benefit. He supported the Tract Society, where they sent tracts around the world, until he found out that they didn't necessarily support all the things that he was involved in. He had become temperance-minded before he was a Christian. He'd given up tobacco. He gave up tea because they went to Mrs. Bunker's, where they lived after they sold their home, and he drank her tea and she couldn't go to sleep that night. And so he decided it wasn't good for him, so he wasn't going to drink that again. Eventually gave up meat, gave up sweets, all these things long before Ellen White had her vision. He decided to build a farm away from the home place, sold it to the home place to his brother, and he was going to educate young people, both boys and girls, in technical aspects and scholastic aspects. But one of the things, and I read an article this week and I said, oh Lloyd, you've got to read this. It's in the review, so for those of you who get it or get it online, it's called Joseph Bates and Adventism's Radical Roots. Most of you know that Joseph Bates was an abolitionist. A lot of our founders were. John Byington, we're pretty sure, had a stop on the Underground Railway in his house. We know he had one in the church across the street that he built. But I had not realized about Bates, so if you'll bear with me, I want to tell you some things. Bates was a part of the radical Garrisonian abolitionists. Now, I knew about William Lloyd Garrison. In 1831, he began to publish a weekly paper called The Liberator in Boston, and he insisted that new Christians would not support national government or establish churches because they sanctioned slavery through law and fellowship with people who upheld that particular institution. So in April of 1835, now Bates has been retired about 6 years now, he and 40 other abolitionists in Fairhaven organized a society. And their goal was to end slavery and to give freedom to the free blacks. And I should say here, we have a room in the museum at Bates, and in it, the artist's conception of what the room will look like, because it's a process still happening to get all the parts of the museum. There's 2 long chains that you see related to blacks in slavery. And I cannot tell you the number of people who've walked in there and tears come to their eyes. And then as we tell the stories, more tears come. And I've always said, you know, Bates is an abolitionist. He believed in the freedom of all. But I learned something else, that most Northerners scorned the Garrisonians and sometimes inflicted violence upon them because they were so radical. They wanted to immediately stop slavery, and they wanted equal rights for the free blacks in the North. And one of the other things they did, this group also advocated for women's rights. And Bates was very involved politically. His wife, Prudence, was co-founder of the Fairhaven Ladies Anti-Slavery Society, served as its vice president and executive committee member. The Northern men began to oppose women acting politically by petitioning Congress. Bates and the group responded directly that women, when she pleads for the oppressed and labors to help and relieve their conditions, acts worthy of herself and of her high duties and an intellectual, moral, and accountable being. We had known some of this for a while because when the Bates family home is sold, you want to put up the next picture, because this is the family home that Joseph inherited from his parents. He sells it to his brother. His wife signs the deed, 1831. Women didn't always sign deeds, and definitely not when it's your inheritance from your side of the family. The other thing, the last few years of their lives, they lived with the Bunker family. Prudence Bates was the executor of Captain Bunker's estate. So she was quite a businesswoman, and it probably goes back to their work during the abolitionist times. In the fall of 1839, Joseph Bates joins William Miller, the Millerite movement. But that same year, he's the president of the Abolitionist Society in Fairhaven. And it's kind of interesting. He began to circulate petitions and send them to the Massachusetts State Legislature, the U.S. House of Representatives, and the U.S. Senate. And this man says that many of his petitions have been destroyed, but the ones that remain, he wanted eradication of the gag law that forbade discussion of slavery in Congress. He protested that Texas and Florida would be admitted as slave states. He protested he wanted the abolition of interstate slave trade, and he wanted the extinction of slavery in the District of Columbia. That wasn't enough. He also petitioned that the United States recognize the independence of Haiti and that the New England Jim Crow segregation laws be eliminated. And this one kind of took me by surprise, and that interracial marriage laws in Massachusetts be abolished. Those are still there today and can be found. There's one thing I skipped over, and I don't remember where it is, so I'll have to tell you by memory. In June of 1841, Bates led his own congregation, which was the Christian Connection. They had built a church in town, and he built it with 2 brothers, the Delano brothers. Any of you heard the name Delano? Right. This is Joseph Bates built a church with Franklin Delano Roosevelt's grandfather and great uncle. Now listen to this church. They established itself as a staunch abolitionist church. We cannot receive in our fellowship as a chairman or Christian minister a slaveholder or an apologist of slavery. So that tells you a little bit about Joseph Bates as an abolitionist. One thing I'll quickly tell, and I probably shouldn't, but, and I forgot it, so I won't.
Well, you can see that already Joseph Bates is being active as a Christian and also as a moral reformer in his society. And he's doing...
I know what I remembered. A few years later, Captain Whitfield picked up 5 Japanese sailors who were stranded at sea. Their ship had been lost. It was illegal for Japanese to immigrate. Captain Whitfield picked them up and took them to Hawaii. 3 of the boys decided to return to Japan because they could face death if they immigrated. But one boy went home with him. I mean, we're talking boys because they were like 15, 14 years old. That young man, Captain Whitfield adopted him as his son, and they went to church. First, probably the Congregational Church. The deacon tapped him on the shoulder and said, "Your boy will have to sit in the back." They didn't go back to that church. They went to another church. Same thing happened. The 3rd week, they went to the Christian Connection Church, which is this one Joseph Bates and the Delano brothers had founded. And he was allowed to sit with his captain father. When he eventually went back to Japan, and when Japan was open to the West, Marginal was the main person who did that. And it was a result of his experience in Fairhaven with the fair treatment because of him, even though he was a person of a different color.
Well, Joseph Bates obviously was an activist. And a lot of the causes he was involved in were causes that corresponded to a way of thinking that if we just have enough social recovery programs, we can create a perfect environment. And so his temperance work was designed as a part of that. The abolitionist work, we're going to make laws that will make society perfect. And then he heard of a man by the name of William Miller that was preaching that Christ was coming soon. Now, the traditional belief system at that time was that Christ would come at the end of 1,000 years, and William Miller was preaching the radical idea that Jesus would come at the beginning of the 1,000 years. And not only that, it would be a literal coming where God would transform all of society. And so Bates, while he continued marginally with some of these activist programs, he threw most of his energy and support into preaching the second coming of Christ. Because if Christ was coming, he was going to take care of all the social ills of society. And so he invested his fortune, and he spent his time. He became a Millerite preacher himself.
And we should have divided this next section up, but you're going to get an extra dose of me. In March of 1844, they had expected Jesus to come between March of 1843 and March of 1844. In February of 1844, Joseph Bates sells his home, the one he had built that was supposed to be a school that he never got around to because he was so busy preaching the Millerite message. And he decides that he's going to Maryland to preach. Now, Joseph Bates is an abolitionist. What's Maryland? Maryland is a slave state. Frederick Douglass escaped from Maryland in 1838. Just about the time Bates is starting an abolitionist society, he comes to New Bedford, right across the river. So I bet Bates knew Frederick Douglass. So he knows what Maryland's like. In fact, they had a member of the Fairhaven Abolitionist Society that went to Charleston, South Carolina on business, and they found out that he was a member of the abolitionists, and he recanted his abolitionist position for fear that he would not survive if he didn't. Also, the newspapers had picked as a story of two men who'd gone to Virginia, and they were sent out of the country because of their abolitionist views. So Bates decides he wants to go to Maryland to preach. He wants to take with him Heman Gurney or Hiram Gurney. His name's spelled both ways. The historian that I truly respect calls him Heman. A person who came to visit us last summer says very strongly that they've seen the death certificate and it says Hiram. So I usually call him Mr. Gurney to be safe. Mr. Gurney was a singing blacksmith, and Bates wanted Gurney to go with him. Now, Gurney was a wise man, and he had no desire to go to Maryland. But Bates, as if you haven't noticed, he's gone from hiding under the table to now being fairly persistent in what he wants. So he talks Gurney into going to Philadelphia with him to hear William Miller preach. Again, they'd heard him before. He'd come to Fairhaven. They go. And somehow at that point in time, Gurney decides that he will go with them. They go to what is called Kent Island in Maryland, where 27 winters before Joseph Bates had been on a boat that was encased in ice and lost in the sea. He was not a captain at that point in time. He had gone to Baltimore and helped the owners reclaim some of their goods, and so that wasn't a total loss, and people on Kent Island still remembered him. And so he goes there to preach, and they remember him, and so they give him a hearing. But this man comes in, and he says, in 10 minutes, I can refute everything Bates has said. So Bates said he stood to the side and said, okay, you may do it. Well, the man got confused rather quickly, and he ended up, and I'm going to read it because it's better than I could say. He says, we are all ready for that, sir. Oh, he said, it began to talk about riding us on a rail out of town. Have any of you heard that expression? The split rail fence, and they'd put people on it, and it wasn't comfortable. And Bates's quip was, we're all ready for that, sir. If you put a saddle on it, we would rather ride than walk. And that caused the sensation of the meeting. And then he said, you must not think that we have come 600 miles through the ice and snow at our own expense to lecture to you without first sitting down and counting the cost. And now if the Lord has no more for us to do, we might as well lie at the bottom of Chesapeake Bay as anywhere else until the Lord comes. And if he has more work for us to do, you can't touch us. And so someone stood up, the meeting changed, they had converts there. So they went on he's got several pages. I won't tell you all, but I'll tell you 2 other experiences. And I was going to do it differently. But they would allow the black slaves to come and stand in the back. They couldn't sit, but they could come and hear. And at the end of one of the meetings, Gurney sang a song. It's in the hymnal, I'm but a stranger. In the Millerite hymn verse, there's 7 stanzas. And the slave came up to Gurney and said, I would like a copy of that. And Gurney said, I can't give it to you. It's the only one I have. The man follows them to their lodging house where they're staying. And he pulls out of his pocket a quarter. And he said, I will give you this for that song. Well, Gurney and Bates are both pretty overwhelmed because a quarter was probably where he had gotten it as a slave, and that was a significant amount of money, and he was willing for that one song. So it's reported that Gurney sat down and wrote out a copy for the man. And when the Andrews Seminary students come, they sing it out from under the tree out in front. They sing out there. And Dr. Bird always says, can you imagine the slaves as they were working the plantations, singing, I'm but a stranger here. Anyways, One other one that's kind of interesting and got my attention. When they left there, they wrote a letter to the judge in the next town. He took them in and listened. They had converts in each place. And finally, they were on the eastern shore of Maryland, and they were speaking, and this well-dressed man came in, and he sat down. And when Bates made a point, I just looked at the time, and it got my attention. When the man shook his head, and Bates said, "No, I see this gentleman here's not agreeing with us." And it was amazing. That happened a couple of times. At the end, the man came up and said, "Please come to my home." And Bates says, "Well, I have a friend. Bring your friend. We've been invited out to dinner. I'll wait." They went, and when they turned into the house, Bates thought they went forever and ever and ever. It was 3 miles from the gate of the plantation to the plantation house. That's kind of the size of this plantation. And then the man, when they sit down there with the wife, he tells, "Wife, remember the dream I had? That 2 men came and preached. And I disagreed with them and shook my head." He said, "These are the 2 angels I saw in my dream." Bates goes back to Massachusetts to prepare for the second coming.
Joseph Bates had arrived at the idea or the understanding that Christ would come in 1844 based on William Miller's preaching, an interpretation of Daniel 8:14 and the time prophecies of Daniel. And so he comes back to Fairhaven now, to this home where his parents reside, and waits for Jesus to come. Now, he'd sold his own property, and he's now homeless, basically. And he waits for Jesus to come. And Jesus doesn't come. Can you imagine how disappointing that would be, to have staked all of your hopes and dreams on Jesus coming to solve all of the world's ills, and now it doesn't happen? Now he's the laughingstock of his community. His own son left home the day before the great disappointment, October 21. Or the disappointment was on the 22nd. As if the son was saying, "Dad, I don't want to have anything to do with this teachings of yours." Must have broken a man's heart.
He was 14, like his father.
Now, I don't know if you can tell, but we're excited about what we do and the stories that we have to tell. We don't have the time today to tell anything about the second career of Joseph Bates. So we'll have to save that for another time. But Joseph Bates, after the great disappointment, was not idle. He continued to be a civic leader in his community, and he continued his Bible study, and he made some very important discoveries. But the thing we want to leave you with today was this message: we have nothing to fear for the future, except as we shall forget the way the Lord has led us and his teachings in our past history. Amen. So our history is important. And I get concerned sometimes. And that's one of the reasons we have places like the Joseph Bates home, so that people who've not yet heard the story can hear how God has led in the formation of this wonderful church we call the Seventh-day Adventist Church. Let's pray. Father in heaven, we thank you this morning for men like Joseph Bates, men of character, men of stamina, men of courage. And we thank you for the way that you've used men, flawed as they are, to establish a great work of Christianity and our part in it. And we pray that we'll be faithful to the calling that you give us right where we are, today and every day forward. In Jesus' name, amen.